Before we begin, if you enjoy wandering through the peculiar and the quietly unsettling, consider subscribing to Nightfall. Notions. Here, the stories are soft enough to whisper but strange enough to linger. Chapter 1. The Last Moonlit Night. The moon had always been a generous guest in the village of Hollow's End. It arrived punctually each month, spilling its silver light over the thatched roofs, the crooked fence posts, and the worn cobblestones of the square. The villagers, though not prone to grand displays of sentiment, had long ago settled into the habit of celebrating its visits with a modest festival, a night of spiced cider, fiddle music, and the kind of laughter that only blooms under the certainty of familiarity. On this particular evening, the moon hung heavier than usual, its glow so thick it seemed to pool in the hollows of the village like liquid. The air smelled of burnt sugar and damp earth, and the children, sensing the unspoken permission of a late bedtime, darted between the legs of their elders, their cheeks sticky with stolen sweets. Old man Harlow, who had seen more moons than anyone, sat on his usual bench by the well, squinting upward as if trying to decipher some hidden message in the pockmarked face above. "It's a fine one tonight," remarked Widow V, passing him a clay cup of cider. The drink was warm, and the spices clung to the back of the throat like a half-remembered dream. Harlow grunted in agreement, though his fingers tightened around the cup. "Aye," he said. "Too fine." No one paid him any mind. Harlow had a reputation for sour pronouncements, and the village had learned to let them slide off like rainwater. The fiddler struck up a lively tune, and the square erupted into clumsy dancing. Boots scuffed against stone, and the hems of skirts grew dusty. Even the mayor, a man who usually moved as if he were made of splinters, allowed himself a stiff jig, much to the delight of the onlookers. Only the youngest among them noticed the moon's peculiar behavior. Little Else, barely 5 and prone to staring, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama," she whispered, "the moon's winking." Her mother, flushed and breathless from dancing, patted her head absently. "That's just the clouds, sweet." But Else knew better. The moon wasn't obscured by clouds. It was flickering, like a candle fighting a draft. By midnight, the cider barrels were drained, and the villagers stumbled home, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, humming snatches of songs they wouldn't remember by morning. The moon, now high and small, watched them go. Its light, usually so persistent, seemed to withdraw slightly, as if hesitating. In the days that followed, no one remarked on the moon's absence at first. The sky was often cloudy in Hollow's End, and besides, there was work to be done. The fields demanded attention, the fences needed mending, and the baker's oven had cracked, requiring a week of frantic repairs. It wasn't until the new moon phase came and went without the usual return of their silvery visitor that the first whispers began. The children were the first to voice it. "Where's the moon?" they asked, their small faces pressed to the window panes at night. The adults shushed them, blaming the season, the weather, their own tired eyes. But by the third week, even the most stubborn among them had to admit something was amiss. The nights were darker than they had ever been, the kind of dark that pressed against the windows like a living thing. Candles burned down faster, as if the shadows were hungrier than usual. Harlow, who had known this would happen, or at least claimed he had, took to sitting by his fireplace, muttering about ingratitude. "We took it for granted," he told his cat, who was not interested. "All things leave when they're not appreciated." The village, of course, did not appreciate this line of thinking. They were practical people, and practical people do not mourn celestial bodies. They assumed the moon would return, as all things did, in time. But as the weeks stretched into months, the darkness settled deeper, and the once festive square grew quiet. The fiddler's fingers grew stiff from disuse. The cider turned sour in its barrels. And Els, who had seen the moon wink, began to dream of it, not as a distant, indifferent orb, but as a traveler, growing smaller and smaller on a road they would never find. The night the moon left, it had been watching, and now it was gone. Chapter 2. The first moonless dawn. The morning after the moon should have returned, but didn't. Dawn arrived like a thief, creeping in gray and hesitant. The villagers of Hollow's End blinked at the sky, as if expecting the moon to be hiding just behind the horizon, ready to leap back into place with a sheepish grin. But the sky remained empty, and the unease that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. By midday, the square was crowded with people who had abandoned their work, their chores, and in some cases their good sense. Arguments sprouted like weeds. "It's an omen," declared Widow V, clutching her shawl as if the absence of moonlight had made the air colder. "Mark my words, the heavens are displeased." "Or maybe it's just late," snapped the baker, whose bread had been coming out wrong since the nights turned black. "Things run behind sometimes, even stars." Old Man Harlow, who had been listening from his bench with the smug patience of someone who had already said, "I told you so 3 times that week," finally spoke up. "The moon doesn't forget. It doesn't dawdle. It's gone because it chose to go." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. No one liked Harlow's tone, least of all the mayor, who had spent the morning pretending this was all a minor scheduling error. "Nonsense," he said, smoothing his vest. "The moon is a reliable body. It's governed by laws, divine or mathematical. Either way, it doesn't just leave." The villagers nodded, eager for an authority to cling to. But then little Else, who had been sitting on the edge of the well, swinging her legs, piped up, "Maybe it got tired of us." Silence. Even Harlow looked at her, one eyebrow raised. Else shrugged. "We never thanked it." That night the village did something it hadn't done in generations. It lit lanterns along every path, every windowsill, as if to prove they could make their own light. The effect was pitiful. The lanterns guttered in the wind, casting wavering shadows that made the familiar streets look unfamiliar. The children, who usually begged to stay up late, huddled under blankets, peering out at a sky that no longer felt like theirs. By the third moonless night, theories had multiplied like rabbits. The shepherds claimed the flocks were restless, the ewes refusing to settle without the moon's watchful eye. The fishermen grumbled about the tides being sluggish, as if the sea itself was sulking. And the town's sole scholar, a reedy man named Piers, who spent most of his time squinting at moldy books, announced he had uncovered an ancient text that spoke of a moon that once left a kingdom in punishment for its arrogance. This did not help morale. The mayor, sensing control slipping away, called a meeting in the square. "We are not a kingdom," he said firmly. "We are a village, a sensible, humble village. The moon will return when it returns. In the meantime, we carry on." But carrying on was harder than expected. Without moonlight, the nights stretched longer, and sleep became fitful. People woke at odd hours, convinced they had heard something moving in the dark. The blacksmith swore he saw shapes near the edge of the woods, tall, thin things that vanished when he raised his lantern. Others whispered of dreams where the moon spoke in a voice like distant thunder, saying nothing they could understand, but leaving them with a hollow ache upon waking. Then came the first real consequence. Old Man Harlow's cat, a creature of precise habits, had always hunted by moonlight. Now it sat on the porch, staring at the sky and refusing to move. One morning, they found it stiff and cold, as if it had simply given up. Harlow buried it without a word, but the sight of him, a man who mocked sentiment, standing over a tiny grave with his hat in his hands, sent a new wave of dread through the village. Perhaps the moon hadn't just been decoration. Perhaps it had been keeping something out. By the end of the week, the debates had shifted from "where is the moon" to "what do we do now?" Some suggested prayers. Others proposed sending a rider to the next town to see if their moon was missing too. This was met with derision. "What, did it fall down a well there?" scoffed the baker. Only Else seemed to have a plan. That evening, She dragged a stool to the center of the square, climbed onto it, and began to sing. It was a wordless tune, something half remembered from the last festival. At first the villagers frowned, assuming it was a child's game. But then Widow V, of all people, joined in. Then the baker, humming gruffly. Soon the entire square was filled with off-key, uncertain singing. Not to summon the moon exactly, but because it was the only thing left to try. High above, the stars watched, unmoved. But somewhere, far away, something listened. Chapter 3. The Elder's Grim Theory. Old Man Harlow had always been the sort of person who hoarded knowledge, like others hoarded firewood, keeping it close, doling it out sparingly, and only when absolutely necessary. So when the villagers gathered in the square on the 10th moonless night, desperate for answers, no one expected him to speak. But when he cleared his throat and rose from his bench, even the wind seemed to quiet in anticipation. "You want to know why the moon left?" he said, his voice like dry parchment. "Fine, but you won't like it." The villagers leaned in. Even the mayor, who had spent the last week insisting this was all a temporary celestial hiccup, folded his arms and waited. Harlow took a long sip of his cider, now brewed stronger to compensate for the darkness, and began. Generations ago, before Hollow's End was Hollow's End, when it was just a handful of huts and a shared fear of wolves. The moon wasn't just a light in the sky. It was a guest, a visitor who chose to return. And like any guest, it expected to be welcomed. The crowd shifted. This already sounded uncomfortably like what little elves had said days ago. Harlow ignored them. Back then people knew better than to take it for granted. They left offerings, not much, just a bit of milk, a handful of grain, to show their thanks. They told stories about it, sang to it, made sure their children knew its name. "Name?" interrupted the baker. "It's the moon. It doesn't have a name." Harlow gave him a look that could have curdled milk. "Everything has a name. You just didn't bother to learn it." He took another sip. But over time, people got comfortable. The offerings stopped. The songs faded. The moon kept coming, so they assumed it always would. And then one night, just like now, it didn't. A murmur ran through the crowd. Widow V clutched her shawl tighter. What happened? Harlow's smile was thin and humorless. The first time it was gone for a year. Crops failed. Animals refused to breed. The nights weren't just dark, they were hungry. People started seeing things in the shadows, things that shouldn't have been there. Finally, the village elder, my great-grandfather, if you're keeping track, realized their mistake. He gathered everyone and made them apologize. Properly. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The mayor cleared his throat. "That's a nice story, Harlow, but it's just a story. The moon isn't some temperamental house guest. It's a rock in the sky." Harlow shrugged. "Believe what you want, but ask yourself this. Why is it always the oldest stories that sound the craziest? Because we've forgotten how to listen to them." Little elves, who had been sitting cross-legged at the front of the crowd, frowned. What did they see in the dark? Harlow's expression darkened. Things that belong in the dark. Things that stay there when the moon's watching. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. The baker scoffed, but it lacked conviction. The scholar, Piers, chewed his lip thoughtfully. "There are accounts," he admitted. "Medieval texts describing moonless terrors. Most scholars dismissed them as superstition, but now the moon's gone," finished Widow V. "And we've got terrors of our own." She wasn't wrong. In the days since the moon's disappearance, the village had changed. The nights weren't just dark. They were dense, suffocating. People reported hearing whispers in the fields, though no one was there. Livestock vanished without a sound. And worst of all, the dreams, always the same. A vast, empty sky, and the creeping sense of something waiting just beyond sight. The mayor, sensing the mood turning against him, raised his hands. Even if there's truth to this, what do we do? Sing? Dance? Hope the moon takes pity on us. Harlow snorted. Pity's got nothing to do with it. The moon doesn't owe us anything. But if we want it back, we have to prove we remember it. Not as a light, as a guest. The villagers shifted uncomfortably. The idea of apologizing to the sky felt absurd, but so did the alternative. A lifetime of this creeping, hungry dark. It was Els who broke the stalemate. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and said, "I'll sing first." And so, beneath a star-choked sky, the villagers of Hollow's End began the long, uncertain work of remembering. They sang the old songs, halting and off-key. They lit candles in windows, not to push back the dark, but to say, "You were here. We're paying attention." When the baker, grudgingly, left a loaf of bread at the edge of the woods. Even the mayor, though he rolled his eyes, recited a half-remembered poem about the moon's kindness. Harlow watched it all with grim satisfaction. "Took you long enough," he muttered. No one knew if it would work. But as the night wore on, the wind shifted, just slightly, as if something far above had paused to listen. Chapter 4. The Desperate Rituals. The morning after the villagers' first attempts to beckon back the moon, the sky remained stubbornly empty. But desperation, as it often does, bred creativity and absurdity. The baker, perhaps inspired by his own earlier skepticism, or perhaps simply because he was running out of flour and customers, decided the problem required a more tangible approach. He spent an entire afternoon crafting an elaborate moon-shaped pie, complete with crisscrossed pastry to mimic its craters. He placed it on the village well at dusk, stepping back with the solemnity of a priest performing a sacrament. "There," he announced. "Maybe if it sees we've made an effort, it will feel flattered enough to return." By midnight, the pie had been reduced to crumbs by a particularly bold raccoon. The moon did not appear. Undeterred, the villagers escalated their efforts. The shepherds, citing some half-remembered folk tale about lunar affinity for wool, sheared their fattest sheep and arranged the fleece in a spiral pattern in the middle of the square. They stood around it chanting, though no one could agree on what exactly to chant, resulting in a discordant mash of nursery rhymes and drinking songs. Old man Harlow observed this from his bench, sipping cider and occasionally offering unhelpful commentary like, "If the moon wanted a rug, it would ask." The fleece remained untouched by celestial bodies, though the village cats found it delightful. Meanwhile, the town's self-proclaimed scholar, Piers, had buried himself in his mouldering books and emerged with what he claimed was an ancient lunar summoning ritual. It involved precisely 12 candles, a circle of salt, and, for reasons no one could explain, a single left shoe. The villagers humored him, if only because the alternative was admitting they had no better ideas. They gathered in the square at midnight, holding their breath as Piers muttered incantations in what he insisted was the tongue of the old ones, but sounded suspiciously like bad Latin. Nothing happened. Widow Vey, never one to be outdone, declared that the moon was clearly a creature of vanity and needed to be complimented back into the sky. She organized a line of villagers, each tasked with shouting a flattering phrase skyward at dusk. "Your glow is unparalleled," cried the blacksmith. "Your craters are very symmetrical," added the miller's wife. Little Else, after some thought, called up, "We miss your face." Still, the sky stayed dark. The mayor, sensing both the futility and the rising panic, attempted to restore order. "Perhaps we're overcomplicating this," he said, straightening his vest. "The moon is a practical entity. It responds to practicality." With that, He marched to the center of the square, looked directly at the star-speckled void where the moon should have been, and said very clearly, "We formally request your return at your earliest convenience." Then he nodded, as if he'd just concluded a business transaction. Predictably, nothing changed. As the days passed, the rituals grew increasingly bizarre. The children, led by elves, constructed a makeshift moon out of a wheel covered in stolen bedsheets, and rolled it through the streets, hoping the real one might see and feel obligated to take its place. The fishermen strung up their nets between the trees, convinced the moon might somehow get tangled in them. Even old man Harlow, despite his sneering, was spotted leaving a bowl of cider at the edge of the woods, though he vehemently denied it later. The breaking point came when the blacksmith, a man not known for his imagination, announced he would forge the moon back. He stoked his furnace to a roaring heat and hammered a lump of silver into a crude, lopsided disc, which he then hoisted atop his chimney to show it how it's done. The result was less celestial body and more misshapen platter, but for one night at least, Hollow's end had a dim metallic glow atop one roof. It did not, however, lure the real moon. By the third week of these antics, the village was exhausted. The baker's hands were raw from kneading symbolic pastries. The shepherd's sheep were shivering without their wool. Pierce had developed a nervous habit of whispering to his books. And still, the nights stretched on, darker and heavier than ever. It was then, in the quiet of another moonless evening, that Els climbed onto the well again. This time, she didn't sing. She just looked up and said very quietly, "We're sorry we forgot about you." No one heard her. No one saw the way the stars seemed to flicker, just for a moment, as if something far away had stirred. But the next night, for the first time in weeks, the dreams changed. Instead of empty skies, the villagers dreamed of a single silver thread, stretching from the earth to the heavens, thin, fragile, but there. And in the darkest hour before dawn, on the edge of waking, they thought they heard something whisper back. Chapter 5. The starving crops. The first stalks of wheat bent and yellowed before anyone thought to connect it to the missing moon. Farmer Burl, a man whose hands were more soiled than skin, noticed it on a dry, windless morning. He crouched in his field, pinching a brittle stem between his fingers, and felt something cold settle in his gut. "Moon rot," old man Harlow declared when Burl brought a handful of shriveled grain to the square. The villagers had gathered again, not for rituals this time, but simply because standing alone in the dark had become unbearable. "Moon what?" the mayor snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bluster. Harlow rolled the grain in his palm. "Plants need moonlight same as sunlight. Not as much, maybe, but enough. Without it, they forget how to grow proper." The villagers glanced at each other. The children, hungrier lately, though no one had said it aloud, fidgeted near the well. The baker, who had been rationing flour for weeks, wiped his hands on his apron and said nothing. Burl's field wasn't the only one suffering. The bean vines curled inward like clenched fists. The apple trees dropped their fruit too early, the flesh inside mealy and sour. Even the hardy root vegetables, usually resilient against any hardship, grew stunted and pale, as if they'd been drained of something vital. Widow Vey, whose herb garden had once supplied the whole village with remedies, lifted a sprig of withered thyme. "My grandmother used to say, moonlight fed the roots at night while the sun slept." I thought it was just talk. It wasn't just the crops. The cows gave less milk. The hens laid fewer eggs. The river, though still flowing, seemed sluggish, its fish listless. The village moved through their days slowly, as if the darkness had seeped into their bones. The mayor, ever practical, called a meeting. "We'll plant more," he insisted. "Work longer hours. Irrigate better." Farmer Burl shook his head. "Ain't about work, it's about—" He gestured helplessly at the sky. That night, for the first time, the villagers didn't bother lighting lanterns in the square. What was the point? The darkness had won. They sat in silence instead, listening to the creak of the empty well rope and the occasional distant hoot of an owl, the only creature that seemed to thrive in this new order. Little Else, who had grown quieter as the days passed, tugged at Harlow's sleeve. "What do we eat when the food's gone?" Harlow didn't answer right away. He studied the sky, where the stars hung like indifferent spectators. "Things find a way," he said at last, "even in the dark." The next morning, the villagers awoke to find their nightmares had taken physical form. Overnight, a creeping white mold had spread across the remaining crops, a fungus no one recognized that glowed faintly when touched, as if mocking the missing moon. Farmer Burl took one look and began pulling up plants in frantic handfuls. "Leave it," Harlow said. Burl whirled on him. "He'll choke everything." Harlow knelt, pressing a finger to the glowing strands. "Or maybe it's the only thing that'll grow for us now." The mayor, watching from the path, swallowed hard. For the first time since the moon left, he had nothing to say. That evening the village ate sparingly, soup made from the last of the untainted vegetables, bread stretched thin with sawdust. The children licked their bowls clean. The adults pretended not to notice. And high above, unseen but felt, the absence grew heavier. The world tilted further out of balance. The crops weren't just starving. They were forgetting how to live. Chapter 6. The Watchmaker's Solution. On the first day of the 7th moonless month, the villagers awoke to the sound of hammering from the workshop at the edge of town. This was unusual for two reasons. First, because the town's watchmaker, a gaunt and perpetually oil-stained man named Lems, had not been seen in public since before the moon disappeared. Second, because no one in Hollow's End had possessed a working timepiece in years. By midday, curiosity outweighed caution, and a small crowd gathered outside Lem's soot-streaked workshop. The mayor cleared his throat and knocked. The hammering stopped. A long silence followed. Then the door creaked open just wide enough to reveal one of Lem's bloodshot eyes. "What?" he said flatly. The mayor, who had prepared a diplomatic speech, promptly forgot it. "We heard noises," he managed. Lems blinked. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and gestured into the dim interior of his workshop. The villagers crowded in, their noses assaulted by the smells of hot metal, burning tallow, and something suspiciously like singed hair. At first they saw only the usual chaos: tables littered with gears, half-dismantled clocks, and what appeared to be a very frustrated attempt at a self-stirring teacup. Then Widow V gasped and pointed upward. Hanging from the rafters, suspended by a network of wires and pulleys, was a metal disc nearly 5 feet across. Its surface was a patchwork of hammered tin and stolen mirrors, its edges lined with precisely spaced holes through which candlelight flickered. A complex system of weights and gears hung beneath it, ticking softly. "Is that—" Farmer Burl began. "A functional lunar approximation," Lems interrupted. He wiped his hands on an already filthy rag. "Not a perfect replica, obviously, but it will provide the essential characteristics: reflected light, predictable phases, and—" He tapped a gear, causing the disk to rotate slightly. "Tidal simulation, give or take." The villagers stared. Old Man Harlow, who had been silent until now, let out a bark of laughter. "You built a fake moon." Lem scowled. "I built a solution." A debate erupted instantly. The baker insisted it was blasphemy. The shepherds argued that any light was better than none. Widow V worried aloud about offending the real moon further, while the mayor rubbed his temples and muttered about civic expenses. Through it all, Lem stood with his arms crossed, his expression suggesting he deeply regretted opening the door. Only Els seemed genuinely delighted. She clapped her hands as she circled the contraption. "Will it move across the sky?" Lems softened slightly. "In theory, the pulleys need testing." That evening, against Harlow's protests and the baker's muttered oaths, the villagers helped Lems haul his creation to the top of the old watchtower at the edge of town. The structure had been unused for decades, its stones crumbling, but it was the highest point in Hollow's End. As the last light faded, Lems lit the candles inside the disc, 20 in all, their flames shielded by glass, and released the counterweight. With a shudder and a groan of unoiled gears, the mechanical moon began its slow journey across the makeshift skyline. The effect was unsettling. The light was harsher than moonlight, more yellow than silver, and it flickered where the real moon had been constant. The shadows it cast were jagged things that twitched with every minor hiccup in the mechanism. But it was light. For the first time in months, the village square wasn't pitch black. The reactions were immediate. The children laughed and chased the moving shadows. The shepherds, though skeptical, admitted their flocks seemed calmer. Even the baker, after an hour of glowering, grudgingly acknowledged that his yeast had risen better than it had in weeks. Only Harlow remained unconvinced. He sat on his usual bench, watching the jerky progress of Lem's creation with narrowed eyes. "It's not the same," he muttered to no one in particular. Else, sitting beside him, tilted her head. "Does it have to be?" Harlow had no answer. That night, the village slept, not well, but better. The mechanical moon's light seeped through shutters and around door frames, a poor imitation, but an imitation nonetheless. In their dreams, some villagers saw a silver thread stretching upward, thinner than before. Others dreamed of ticking. And high above, beyond the reach of gears and candles, something vast and silent observed the flickering imitation below. Whether it was amused or insulted, no one could say. Chapter 7. The Children's Moon Drawings. The idea came from Widow V, though she would later deny it. She had been watching the village children play hopscotch in the square one afternoon, their chalk lines glowing faintly under Lem's mechanical moon, when she noticed something peculiar. "You there?" she called to Els, who was busy explaining the rules to a younger boy. "Draw me the moon." Els blinked. "Which one?" "The real one," Widow V said, and immediately regretted it. The children gathered around, their small hands clutching bits of chalk. At first, they drew with confidence. Big, round shapes with smiley faces and exaggerated craters. But as the afternoon wore on, their certainty wavered. The older children hesitated, their lines growing shaky. The younger ones simply copied what the others drew, their moons becoming distorted echoes of echoes. By dusk, the square was covered in dozens of lunar attempts. No two were alike. Some were perfectly circular, others lumpy as potatoes. Some had craters arranged in careful patterns, others with holes punched randomly like worm-eaten wood. One particularly creative child had drawn theirs square, insisting it had corners last time. Old Man Harlow limped through the gallery of chalk moons, his cane tapping against the cobblestones. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "that's that." The adults pretended not to understand what they were seeing, but the truth was undeniable. Already, after just a few months, the memory of the moon was fading. The baker's daughter, who had once won the Harvest Festival moon-gazing contest, could no longer recall whether the Sea of Serenity was on the left or right. The blacksmith's twins argued bitterly over whether the moon had ever cast shadows at all. Lems observed the drawings with professional interest. "Fascinating," he muttered, adjusting a gear in his mechanical moon. "The human eye can't actually perceive craters with naked vision. All these details are imagined." Farmer Burl kicked at a particularly enthusiastic rendering that included what appeared to be lunar sheep. Doesn't matter what it looked like, mattered what it did. That night, the mechanical moon stuttered in its path across the sky, its gears grinding protest. The children, who had gone to bed arguing about lunar geography, dreamed of blank white disks and empty black skies. Els woke sometime near midnight, convinced she'd heard something scratching at her window. Not the usual tree branch, but something with purpose. When she looked, there was nothing but the artificial moonlight casting its uneven glow across her floorboard. The next morning, the chalk drawings were gone. washed away by an unseasonable drizzle. No one remarked on how quickly the rain had come, or how it had fallen only on the square, leaving the surrounding roads dry. No one mentioned the strange silvery residue the water left behind, like liquid mercury that evaporated by noon. Only Harlow, staring at the damp stones where the children's moons had been, allowed himself a grim smile. Still watching then, he murmured, "Too quiet for anyone to hear." That afternoon, the children tried drawing the moon again. This time, their efforts were even more varied, more uncertain. Else alone produced something resembling the real thing, a quiet, cratered sphere with a single thin scar across its face. When asked how she remembered, she just shrugged. "I didn't," she said. "I dreamed it." The adults exchanged glances but said nothing. That night, the mechanical moon's light seemed softer somehow, its movements smoother. And in their dreams, the villagers heard something they hadn't in months, the faint, distant sound of wind across a barren surface, where no wind should be. Chapter 8. The Night Without Shadows. The mechanical moon stopped working at precisely midnight. One moment its uneven light flickered across the village square, casting those twitchy, unnatural shadows that had become familiar. The next, nothing. A complete and total absence of light so profound, it felt like the world had been swallowed. In their beds, the villagers woke all at once, though no sound had disturbed them. It was as if some primal instinct recognized this darkness as different from ordinary night. Farmer Burl sat up, his hand groping blindly for the candle he kept by his bedside. The flame sputtered to life, but the light didn't so much illuminate as cower in the presence of the dark. Outside his window, nothing. No shapes. No outlines. Just blackness so thick it seemed to press against the glass. Down in the square, Lems was already at the base of the watchtower, cranking the gears of his invention with increasing desperation. The mechanism turned smoothly. No broken parts, no jammed weights, but the candles inside refused to light. Not even a spark. "It shouldn't be possible," he muttered to no one. "Wax doesn't just unburn itself." Old Man Harlow found him there, not because he could see him, but because he knew exactly where Lems would be. "It's not your contraption," he said. "It's the dark pushing back." One by one, the villagers gathered, drawn together by instinct more than sight. They clutched lanterns that barely pierced the gloom, their flames guttering weakly as if afraid to shine too boldly. Children clung to their parents' legs. The mayor, trying and failing to sound authoritative, cleared his throat and declared this was simply an unusually cloudy night. Then Widow V spoke from the darkness. "Where are shadows?" The villagers looked down. The lantern light should have stretched their silhouettes across the cobblestones. Instead, the ground remained featureless. The light fell and simply vanished. That was when the panic set in. The baker made a run for his shop, tripping over unseen debris. The shepherds began calling for their flocks, only to realize the animals had gone utterly silent. Even the owls, those ever-present night watchers, had stopped their cries. Only the wind remained, whispering through the empty streets like a thief checking unlocked doors. Else, standing near the well, reached out a hand, not because she expected to find anything, but because the darkness was so complete, she needed to confirm the world still existed beyond it. Her fingers brushed something cold and smooth. "Moon," she whispered. For a moment, the darkness shifted. Not a light, not even a glimmer, but a sense of something vast turning its attention downward. Then the sensation was gone. Harlow, who had been standing perfectly still, let out a slow breath. "First it leaves," he murmured. "Then it takes the shadows with it? What next? The echoes? The air?" No one had an answer. The villagers spent the rest of the night huddled together in the square, their lanterns forming a fragile circle of light that the darkness refused to penetrate. They told stories, old tales about the moon, half-remembered myths about what existed before light. The children, wide-eyed but oddly calm, listened as if memorizing instructions. By dawn, the darkness had retreated as suddenly as it came. Sunlight spilled across the village, revealing nothing out of place, nothing disturbed. The mechanical moon's candles burned again as if they'd never gone out. The shadows returned, stretching long and unordinary across the ground. But the villagers didn't relax. They moved through the day in hushed tones, jumping at ordinary sounds. The baker forgot recipes he'd known for decades. The mayor kept glancing at the sky as if expecting it to vanish. And Els, kneeling by the well where she'd touched that impossible coldness, pressed her palm to the stones and swore she felt something beneath them. Not water, not earth, beating. That night, when the mechanical moon began its jerky journey across the sky, no one slept. They watched from their windows, waiting to see if the darkness would return. It didn't. But in the spaces between the ticks of Lem's invention, in the quiet moments when even breaths seemed too loud, they could have sworn they heard something else breathing back. Chapter 9. The Outsider's Laughter. The merchant arrived on the first truly cold morning of the season, his cart rattling into the village square like a handful of thrown bones. He was a ruddy-faced man with a laugh like a barking dog, and the unfortunate habit of speaking as if every sentence were obvious. When the villagers gathered around his cart, more out of habit than hope, as trade had slowed to a trickle since the moon left, he took one look at Lem's mechanical contraption wobbling above the watchtower and burst into guffaws. "What in the nine hells is that supposed to be?" he wheezed, wiping his eyes. The villagers exchanged glances. The mayor stepped forward, smoothing his vest. "That," he said stiffly, "is our moon." The merchant's laughter redoubled, loud enough to startle a nearby crow into flight. "Your moon? Did it shrink in the wash?" He leaned against his cart, still chuckling. "Listen, friends, why waste time with this nonsense? Pack up and move downstream. Plenty of moonlight in Low Marsh, or Briarvale, or literally anywhere else." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. Farmer Burl's hands clenched at his sides. "This is our land," he said quietly. The merchant waved a dismissive hand. "Land's land. Dirt doesn't care who walks on it." He rummaged in his cart and produced a slightly dented compass. "See? Point your feet south and start walking." Problem solved. Old Man Harlow, who had been observing from his usual bench, spoke without looking up. "And what happens when we take our ungrateful hearts to Low Marsh? You think the moon will welcome us there?" The merchant blinked. "It's not a dog, old-timer. It doesn't hold grudges." He tapped the side of his nose. "Though if you're worried, I've got some lovely silver charms, protective runes. Very reasonable prices." Widow Vey made a noise like a tea kettle boiling over. "You think this is about charms?" Els, peering around the baker's legs, piped up. "We didn't say goodbye." The merchant stared at her, then at the assembled villagers, then at the pathetic flicker of the mechanical moon. His grin faltered slightly. "You people are cracked. The moon doesn't leave. It's always there. You just can't see it sometimes." He shook his head and began repacking his wares with unnecessary force. "Waste of my time." No one stopped him as he climbed back onto his cart. No one bought his charms or his compass or his brightly colored ribbons that warded against ill fortune. They simply watched in silence as he turned his mule around and clattered back the way he'd come, muttering about backward villages and lost causes. Only when he was gone did the villagers stir. The blacksmith spat in the dust where the cart had stood. The baker muttered something unkind about merchants and their mothers. But underneath the anger was something quieter, something more dangerous, doubt. What if he's right? The miller's wife asked that evening as they gathered in the square. What if we're being foolish? Farmer Burr looked at his calloused hands, at the soil permanently ground into the creases. "My grandfather planted these orchards," he said. "His bones are in that field. You think I'll let some peddler tell me to walk away from that?" A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. But later, when the mechanical moon's light flickered over the sleeping village, more than one villager lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering, what if the merchant was right? What if they were clinging to something already lost? Else, curled in her bed, pressed her ear to the floorboards and listened to the strange, slow heartbeat beneath the village. It seemed to quicken just slightly, as if in answer. The next morning, they found the merchant's cart abandoned at the crossroads, the mule grazing peacefully nearby. Of the merchant himself, there was no sign. Just a single silver coin balanced atop his remaining wares, gleaming dully in the weak sunlight. When Lems picked it up, he dropped it immediately. "Cold," he said, shaking his fingers. "Like it's been in shadow too long." No one suggested following the road south after that. Chapter 10. The Poet's Midnight Sermon. The poet arrived unannounced at the midnight hour, when the mechanical moon hung low and sputtered like a dying candle. He was not from Hollow's End. No one could place where he'd come from, but he carried himself with the weary authority of someone who had walked through every village's sorrow and found it equally absurd. Draped in a patchwork cloak that might have been fashionable 3 centuries prior, he climbed onto the dry fountain in the square, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and whatever spectral entities are doubtless listening," he announced, "we gather here tonight to mourn an absentee, a flaky celestial body, a fair-weather friend who couldn't be bothered to send so much as a note." The villagers, roused from their beds by the commotion, blinked sleep from their eyes. Old man Harlow, who had apparently been expecting this, passed around a bottle of something that smelled potent enough to dissolve rust. The poet flourished a tattered scroll. "Let the record show that the moon, heretofore referred to as that silvery bastard, has officially stood us up. No explanation, no forwarding address, just empty sky where poetry used to live." He paused, squinting at Lem's creation as it hiccuped through its mechanical arc. "Though I will admit this replacement is admirably pathetic, like serving turnip soup at a banquet and calling it gravy." A few nervous titters rippled through the crowd. The poet took this as encouragement. Who among us hasn't taken the moon for granted? He pressed a dramatic hand to his chest. "We praised its beauty when convenient, cursed its brightness when trying to sleep, and generally treated it like some cosmic lantern that existed solely for our convenience. And now," he gestured grandly to the heavens, "it has called our bluff. A celestial fine, you do better then. And what have we accomplished?" His gaze landed pointedly on Lem's contraption. A glorified cheese, greater with delusions of grandeur. Lems opened his mouth to protest, but the poet barreled onward. "Perhaps we deserved this. Perhaps we were terrible hosts. We forgot to leave offerings. We stopped telling its stories. We let our children think it was just a decoration." His voice dropped suddenly, the humor draining away. "And now our crops wither. Our nights have teeth. Our shadows have abandoned us. The price of taking light for granted is learning how heavy true darkness can be." The villagers shifted uncomfortably. The poet's words cut too close to the fears they'd been nursing in private. Even Harlow looked thoughtful, though that might have been the liquor. Then, with the abruptness of a cloud passing, the poet's grin returned. "But let's not be too hard on ourselves. After all, the moon could be worse. It could have left a note listing all our faults. It could have taken the stars with it. It could have," he shuddered theatrically, "started charging rent." The laughter this time was louder, tinged with relief. The poet bowed as the mechanical moon's light flickered across his face, making his expression unreadable. "Take heart, good people. Either the moon will return when it's good and ready, or we'll learn to live without it." And if all else fails, he produced a tarnished silver coin from his sleeve and flipped it into the air. It vanished before it could land. "We can always pretend." With that, he hopped down from the fountain and strolled into the shadows between houses. By the time the villagers thought to ask his name, he was gone, though for days after they would occasionally find scraps of verse tucked in odd places. a limerick nailed to the baker's door, a sonnet floating in the well, a single couplet written in the dust of the abandoned merchant's cart. "The moon was never yours to keep, but, oh, how sweetly it let you sleep. Und die Armen im See." That night, for the first time since the darkness had come, the villagers dreamed of moonlight, not as it was, but as they remembered it, imperfectly, longingly. And somewhere beyond the edge of sleep, something vast and silent observed these fragile imitations, these human attempts to recreate what had been lost. Whether it was pleased or disappointed, no one could say. But in the morning, the villagers noticed something odd. Lem's mechanical moon had stopped ticking. The gears stood still. The candles were cold. Yet the village square was bathed in a soft silvery glow that came from nowhere at all. Chapter 11. The Hunter's New Prey. Garrett the hunter had never needed a lantern. In all his 40 years, his eyes had adjusted effortlessly to moonlight, tracing the silver-edged outlines of rabbit trails and deer paths with ease. Now he stood at the forest's edge at dusk, his knuckles white around his bow, staring into a darkness so complete it made his stomach clench. The first week without moonlight, he'd tried hunting as usual. Came back empty-handed, his boots muddy from stumbling into unseen streams, his arrows lost in the underbrush. The second week, he tied bells to his boots to startle prey toward waiting traps. Only caught a terrified fox that screamed so piteously he let it go. Now, as the third week began with no sign of the moon's return, and his belly pressing against his ribs, Garrett did something he'd never done before. He asked for help. Old Man Harlow answered his knock with a bottle in one hand and a knowing look. "Finally admitting you're not half as clever as you think?" Garrett ignored the jab. "You trapped in the dark years. How?" Harlow leaned against his doorframe, the smell of wood smoke and old sweat clinging to him. "Same way blind men do. Stop trusting my eyes." He rummaged inside and tossed Garrett a length of twine, knotted at regular intervals. "Tee this between two trees waist high. Wait upwind with your bow ready." Garrett examined the crude device. "That's it." Harlow's grin showed too many teeth. "Either the rabbit runs into the string and panics, or something bigger does. Either way, you'll hear it." The method worked, but barely. Garrett returned with 2 scrawny hairs that barely made a meal. Worse, the forest felt different now, not just dark, but watchful. Twice he'd knocked an arrow at sounds too large for rabbits, only to find nothing there. Once he'd sworn something breathed just behind his neck, though when he whirled, his torch showed only his own disturbed footprints. The village children began leaving him offerings. Crude drawings of rabbits, small bundles of foraged greens tucked at his doorstep. Else brought him a dried mushroom on a string. "For listening," she said solemnly. When he lifted it to his ear, he heard a faint hum like wind through distant caves. He wore it around his neck when he hunted. The breakthrough came on a night so black, even the stars seemed muted. Garrett had given up on bows entirely, setting snares along game trails during daylight, returning at odd hours to check them. This time, as he felt his way along the twine marking his traps, his fingers brushed something warm and wet. Not blood. The texture was wrong, thicker, like sap. Then the humming mushroom against his chest vibrated sharply. Garrett froze. The forest had gone utterly silent, the way it did when wolves were near. Carefully, slowly, he reached for his knife. Something moved in the dark. Not the quick dart of prey, but a slow, deliberate shifting, like a great weight settling. The air smelled suddenly of turned earth and something sweetly rotten. Garrett's pulse hammered in his throat, but he forced himself to breathe slow, to listen. A whisper of sound to his left. Then, impossibly soft, the crunch of a paw on leaves. Not a rabbit, not a deer. Something that moved with purpose. The mushroom vibrated again, urgent now. Garrett threw himself sideways, just as something swiped through the space where he'd stood. He rolled to his feet, knife raised, though he knew it was useless. Whatever this was, it wasn't of flesh and blood. The darkness before him rippled, coalesced. For one impossible instant Garrett saw eyes, not the reflective gleam of an animal's, but deep liquid black like pools of ink. Then the moment broke, and the presence was gone, leaving only the fading hum of the mushroom and the certainty that he'd been measured. He didn't run. Hunters never ran. But his walk back to the village was the fastest of his life. Harlow was waiting on his porch as if he'd known. "Mate one of the moon's children, did you?" Garrett touched the mushroom pendant, now silent. "What hunts in absolute dark?" Harlow took a long drink. Things that shouldn't exist outside stories, things the moon kept away. He peered at Garrett. "You're lucky it didn't want me tonight." The next morning Garrett built a blind near the village's edge and taught the children how to make bird traps. He still hunted, but never at night, and always with one hand on the humming mushroom. And sometimes when the wind blew from the east, he thought he heard something moving in the trees, not the light step of deer, but the slow, patient tread of something learning the shape of a world without moonlight. Chapter 12. The Lover's Bargain. Mara and Tom had planned their parting under the full moon. It was supposed to be temporary, Tom leaving to apprentice with his uncle's silver mine across the valley, Mara staying to tend her ailing father. They'd stood in the barley field behind the mill, fingers intertwined, and made their promise where the moonlight could witness it. Next full moon after the harvest, Tom had said, pressing a silver button into her palm, mined from his uncle's first vein. "I'll come back then." Mara had kissed him and whispered, "I'll meet you right here." That was 2 days before the moon disappeared. Now the harvest had come and gone, the barley cut and stored, and Tom stood once more in the field under a star-choked sky. No moon illuminated the flattened stalks. No silver light touched the button he'd given her, now sewn into the collar of Mara's dress. She'd arrived first, her lantern casting nervous shadows that twitched without the moon to steady them. Tom reached for her hand. "I could stay." Mara shook her head. Her father coughed violently every night now, a wet sound that made the neighbors wince. And do what? Watch him fade? Watch us starve when the last stores run out? He squeezed his fingers. "The mine has food, real coin. You'll come back when..." "When what?" Tom's voice cracked. "When the moon decides to return. When your father..." He stopped himself. A gust of wind rattled the dry barley stalks. Somewhere in the woods an owl called, one of the few creatures that didn't seem troubled by the endless dark. Mara turned the silver button between her fingers. "We could go now. Both of us." Tom exhaled slowly. The mine foreman had offered him double wages to bring strong workers. But Mara's father couldn't travel, and leaving him would break her, just as staying would break Tom. "Next full moon," he repeated stubbornly, as if saying it could make the celestial body reappear. Mara leaned her forehead against his. In the lantern light, her eyes looked bruised with exhaustion. What if there isn't one? They stood there in the dark, the question hanging between them. The button gleamed dully against Mara's collar, its silver tarnishing without moonlight to polish it. A rustle in the barley made them jump apart. Old Man Harlow emerged from the shadows, his breath fogging in the cold air. He ignored their startled looks and held out a small wooden box. "For promises," he grunted. "Moon's not the only witness in this world." Inside the box lay 2 smooth river stones, one veined with silver, the other with gold. Harlow placed them in the lovers' palms and closed their fingers around them. "Keep 'em close. When you're ready, throw 'em in the mill pond. If they sink, your promise was false. If they float..." He shrugged. "Then maybe something's listening after all." Tom pocketed his stone with a skeptical frown, but Mara clutched hers like a lifeline. The next morning, Tom left with the mine cart. Mara watched from the hilltop until his lantern disappeared into the gloom. She didn't cry. She simply pressed her stone to her lips and whispered, "Come back to me." Back in the empty barley field something stirred, not wind, not animal. The crushed stalks where they'd stood straightened slowly, as if unseen hands were arranging them. And deep in the mill pond, where no light penetrated, 2 stones rested on the silt. Neither had sunk. Neither had floated. They simply hung suspended in the dark water, waiting. Chapter 13. The Baker's Midnight Loaf. For 37 years Baker Durnan had risen at midnight to bake. It wasn't tradition. It was simple practicality. Mix the dough at the witching hour. Let it rise under the moon's watchful eye. Bake as dawn silvered the horizon. The villagers swore his loaves carried a faint luminescence, a certain je ne sais quoi that made his crusts crackle with otherworldly perfection. Travelers would detour through Hollow's End just to taste his moon-kissed rye. Now, as he kneaded dough under the sickly yellow glow of tallow candles, the loaf beneath his hands felt lifeless. It wasn't bad bread. Durnan's hands could craft passable loaves in his sleep, but it lacked the alchemy of his midnight bakes. The crust browned too evenly. The crumb sat heavy in the stomach. Tasteless like sadness, Widow V pronounced that morning, brushing crumbs from her shawl with unnecessary vigor. Durnan wiped flour-streaked hands across his apron. The yeast doesn't care what time it is. Then why does this taste like every other village's sorry excuse for bread? She tossed a coin on the counter. I'll pay double when you go back to proper hours. The problem was the darkness. Without moonlight streaming through the bakery's high windows, the sourdough starter behaved erratically. Durnan's hands, so precise by night, fumbled in daylight. He burned 2 batches of rolls, forgot salt in a third. The children stopped lingering near his door for crust scraps. On the 7th day of this culinary tragedy, Old Man Harlow hobbled in and sniffed the air like a disgruntled bloodhound. "Smells like mediocrity in here." Durnan slammed an oven door. "Take your business elsewhere, then." Harlow leaned on the counter, his breath reeking of last night's cider. "My grandmother used to say moonlight fed more than crops. Said it stirred something in the yeast you can't replicate." He tapped the side of his nose. "Magic in the angles, see? Moonlight hits different than sun. That's idiotic." And yet, Harlow gestewed at the sad array of loaves. That night, Durnan lay awake staring at his flour-dusted ceiling. Outside, Lem's mechanical moon shuddered through its pathetic arc, casting jagged shadows that looked nothing like real moonlight. At precisely midnight, a time his bones knew even without the village bell, he rose and began baking. Without moonlight, he improvised. He polished a tin sheet to reflect candle flame across the rising dough. He whispered old baking charms his mother had taught him. When the first loaf came out of the oven, its crust bore strange, spiraling patterns, as if something had traced invisible fingers through the flour. The taste was different. Not quite his old moon-kissed loaves, but something deeper, richer. A bread that lingered on the tongue like a half-remembered dream. Widow V was first at his door at dawn. She took one bite and froze. "What did you do?" Durnan examined the loaf's peculiar crust, baked in the dark. By noon, the village had devoured every crumb. Children licked their fingers with unusual solemnity. Farmer Burl claimed his aching joints felt better. Even Lems, usually indifferent to food, stared at his empty plate with something like wonder. Only Els noticed the flour footprints leading from the bakery's back door into the woods, prints too large to be human, with odd, elongated toes. She followed them to the tree line, where they vanished abruptly. When she pressed her ear to the ground, she swore she heard a slow, contented chewing sound from deep below the roots. That night, Durnan left a fresh loaf on his windowsill before bed. By morning, it was gone. In its place lay a single silver crumb that glowed faintly when touched. He kneaded it into his next batch, and the loaves rose higher than they had in months. The bread still wasn't moon-kissed, but as the villagers devoured it with quiet intensity, no one seemed to mind that it tasted, instead, of something far older and hungrier. Chapter 14. The village divided. The first fistfight broke out near the dry fountain, when the miller's eldest son accused the mayor's nephew of spooking the moon away with his gambling debts. By noon, the village had split into 3 distinct factions, each more convinced of their righteousness than the last. The penitents gathered in Widow V's cramped parlor, sipping bitter tea and compiling lists of every possible sin that might have offended the heavens. They whispered of Farmer Burrell's great-grandfather cutting down the sacred oak, of the baker's second wife who supposedly consorted with hedge witches, of children born out of wedlock going back 3 generations. Old Man Harlow listened to their increasingly ludicrous theories while whittling a piece of cedar into something suspiciously phallic, occasionally interjecting with helpful comments like, "Don't forget that time Garrett's hound pissed on the standing stone." Across the square, the rationalists convened in the abandoned schoolhouse under Lem's leadership. They spread star charts across dusty desks, arguing over celestial mechanics and the improbable but statistically possible chance of a rogue cloud of cosmic dust obscuring the moon indefinitely. When the blacksmith pointed out that the stars remained clearly visible, Piers the scholar cleared his throat and muttered something about variable opacity. No one was convinced, least of all Piers himself. The third group didn't bother meeting indoors. They simply stood in the middle of the square, arms crossed, and bellowed their position to anyone within earshot. "The moon doesn't give a rat's ass about us," roared the butcher, his face purple with conviction. "It's a big, stupid rock. Rocks don't abandon people, they just are." His followers nodded vigorously, though their eyes kept darting to the sky as if expecting contradiction. Else watched from her perch on the well, kicking her feet against the stones. The village adults had become strange, brittle creatures these past weeks, snapping at shadows and each other with equal fervor. Even the children had taken sides. She'd seen the miller's boys pelting the rationalists' children with acorns earlier, shouting about star worshippers. The only person who seemed unchanged was the baker, who continued producing his peculiar, addictive loaves, regardless of theological debates. Else had taken to pocketing crumbs from his morning batches, sneaking them into the pockets of arguing villagers when they weren't looking. Within minutes the recipients would grow quiet, their angry words dissolving into confused murmurs as they wandered off, chewing thoughtfully. The crisis came to a head when the penitents attempted to burn an effigy of human arrogance in the square. The rationalists objected on scientific grounds, potential fire hazard, while the indifferentists stole the effigy's hat and used it for drinking games. By nightfall, half the village wasn't speaking to the other half. Marriages had been strained, and someone had let the air out of Lem's precious mechanical moon's counterweight system. It was then, as the fractured village prepared to sleep in their separate corners, that Els climbed onto the dry fountain with her stolen pocketful of baker's crumbs. She didn't make a speech. She simply began dropping them one by one into the crowd below, like sowing seeds in a field. The butcher caught the first crumb on instinct. His rant about celestial indifference trailed off mid-syllable. Widow V, reaching automatically for the next morsel, forgot to clutch her pearls of outrage. Even Old Man Harlow paused his whittling to let the strange flavor bloom across his tongue. For the first time in weeks, the square fell silent. Not the tense quiet of suppressed anger, but the soft hush of shared experience. Above them, the broken mechanical moon hung motionless, its gears frozen at the apex of its arc. Beyond it, the real stars glittered, indifferent perhaps, but undeniably present. Els dusted her hands and hopped down. No one stopped her as she walked home, though several villagers absent-mindedly patted her head as she passed. The arguments would resume tomorrow, of course. Humans being what they were, they'd probably find new things to disagree about. But for tonight, at least, they stood together under the same dark sky, chewing the same peculiar bread, united in their silent, full-mouthed bewilderment. Somewhere beyond the village boundaries, in the spaces between tree roots and under river stones, something ancient and hungry noted this development with what might have been approval, or maybe just amusement. It was difficult to tell with primordial entities. Chapter 15. The Boy Who Climbed the Sky. Tobin was not the brightest child in Hollow's End, nor the strongest, nor the most likable. But he possessed a particular quality that set him apart from his peers, an unshakable, almost pathological certainty that if adults couldn't solve a problem, it was only because they hadn't tried the obvious solution. When the moon disappeared while the villagers argued and prayed and built pathetic mechanical replicas, 8-year-old Tobin simply started collecting ladders. He began with the small step ladder from his mother's kitchen, then liberated the orchard ladder from Farmer Burrow's shed. He dragged the rickety painter's ladder from behind the schoolhouse and borrowed Widow V's antique folding ladder when she wasn't looking. By the end of the first week, his collection formed a precarious tower behind the blacksmith shop, lashed together with stolen clotheslines and sheer determination. "You'll break your neck, old man Harlow," observed one afternoon, watching Tobin wobble 20 feet above the ground. Tobin, who had just realized he'd forgotten to account for the fact that ladders were not designed to be stacked horizontally, paused to consider this. "Then I'll be the first person to die reaching for the moon," he declared, and kept climbing. The villagers largely ignored him at first. Children did strange things, especially in times of crisis. But when Tobin's tower surpassed the height of the church steeple, people began taking notice. The rationalists argued it was a safety hazard. The penitents declared it blasphemous. The indifferentists thought it was hilarious and started a betting pool on when he'd fall. Only Else brought him supplies: a stolen pulley from Lem's workshop, a sack of the baker's peculiar bread to keep his strength up, and most importantly a tarnished silver button she'd fished from the mill pond. "For luck," she said, pressing it into his grubby palm. On the morning of his final ascent, half the village gathered to watch. Tobin's tower now swayed alarmingly in the breeze, its patchwork construction creaking like an old man's joints. He tied every blanket in the village to the top as a makeshift flag. "So the moon can see us," he explained to the skeptical crowd below. "Idiot boy," muttered the butcher. "Does he think the moon's just hiding behind a cloud?" "Quiet," snapped Widow V unexpectedly. "At least he's trying." Tobin climbed slowly, methodically, his pockets weighted with stones for balance. The higher he went, the more the tower groaned in protest. At 300 feet, the wind picked up, making the whole structure shimmy like a drunkard. At 400, the villagers below became ant-like specks. And then, disaster. Not the dramatic, splintering collapse everyone expected, but something far more humiliating. A single critical rope snapped. The top third of Tobin's magnificent tower slowly tilted, and lodged itself firmly in the branches of the ancient oak tree at the forest's edge. There he hung, suspended between earth and sky, his moon flag flapping pathetically just out of reach of the stars. For a long moment, the village stood in stunned silence. Then, one by one, they began to laugh. Not cruel laughter, but the helpless, wheezing kind that comes when absurdity finally outweighs terror. The rationalists laughed until they cried. The penitents clutched their sides. Even old man Harlow let out a rusty chuckle. Only Else didn't laugh. She stood very still, staring up at Tobin's dangling form, then at the peculiar way the shadows fell around the base of the oak tree, long and silvered, though no light source could be seen. High above, Tobin kicked his legs in frustration. "I almost had it," he shouted down. "I could see something up here." No one believed him, of course. They were too busy wiping their eyes and fetching more rope for the rescue operation. But that night, as the villagers retired to their homes, several noticed an odd phenomenon. Where Tobin's ladder had disturbed the upper branches of the oak, the leaves glowed faintly, as if brushed with moonlight. And in the deepest part of the forest, where no one dared go after dark, something that had been watching the boy's efforts let out a sound that might have been a sigh, or maybe a chuckle. It was hard to tell with ancient entities. The next morning, the villagers found Tobin back at the base of the oak, already collecting more ladders. His hair was streaked with silver, though no one could say for certain whether it was cobwebs or something else. When asked what he'd seen up there, he just shook his head and kept working. But Els noticed he'd tied the silver button she'd given him to the very top of his new construction, where it caught the starlight and shone with impossible brightness. And if sometimes, in the dead of night, the button seemed to glow with its own inner light, well, that was probably just a trick of the eyes. Chapter 16. The Moon's Secret Admirer. Madame Koth had lived at the edge of Hollow's End for as long as anyone could remember, though no one could quite recall her arrival. She kept to her crumbling cottage, emerging only to trade bundles of peculiar herbs for flour or thread. The village children claimed she could cure warts with a glance and summon storms by hanging her laundry in a particular pattern. Adults called her eccentric, and secretly borrowed her remedies when desperate. She arrived in the square on the first truly cold night of the season, her cloak stitched entirely from patches of twilight blue fabric. The villagers, now accustomed to gathering in the square after dark, as if their collective presence might ward off the unnatural blackness, fell silent as she approached. Even old man Harlow straightened slightly on his bench. "I," she announced in her whispery voice, "am the reason the moon left." A beat of stunned silence. Then the baker snorted. "What? Did you offend it with your cooking too?" Madame Koth fixed him with a look that turned his chuckle into a cough. "For 30 years, she said, I've told the moon my secrets. The names of stillborn children buried without markers. The true ingredients in Widow V's healing tonics. What really happened to the mayor's predecessor." The mayor paled. "I thought it was listening. I thought—" She hesitated, the first unsteady moment anyone had ever seen from her. "Perhaps I bored it." The villagers exchanged glances. The idea that Madame Koth, who reportedly knew where every skeleton in Hollow's End was buried, both literal and metaphorical, could be capable of something as human as loneliness was unsettling. Els, who had been weaving daisy chains in the moonlight that wasn't, piped up. "What was the last thing you told it?" Madame Koth's wrinkled hands tightened around her walking stick. "That I loved it." She said the words like a confession of murder. "Not as a gardener loves rain, or a sailor loves a steady wind. As a woman loves. Foolishly. Entirely." The admission hung in the air, too raw for laughter. Even the rationalist shifted uncomfortably. Old man Harlow broke the silence with characteristic tact. "Well, no wonder it fled. But Madame Koth wasn't finished. The night before it disappeared, I told it something new. That I was tired of loving something that could never love me back." She looked up at the star-choked sky. And then it was gone. A gust of wind rattled the branches of the ancient oak. Somewhere in the forest, something howled, though no wolves had been seen in Hollow's End for generations. Widow V, of all people, was the first to step forward and take Madame Koth's hand. "You great fool," she said not unkindly. "Don't you know the moon loves everyone equally? That's the whole point of it." The village held its breath. Even the mechanical moon seemed to pause in its jerky trajectory overhead. Madame Koth opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak, a sound cut through the night. A sharp, crystalline chime, like silver, struck against stone. It came from the well where Els sat, where the silver button she'd given Tobin now lay glistening with dew, or something like it. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, softly, impossibly, a beam of silver light lanced down from the cloudless sky, illuminating the well for precisely 3 heartbeats before vanishing. When the villagers turned back to Madame Koth, she was smiling for the first time in living memory. "Well," she said, straightening her patchwork cloak, "that was dramatic." No one could agree afterward whether they'd truly seen the light or simply imagined it. The rationalists blamed atmospheric conditions. The penitents declared it a miracle. The indifferentist pointed out that it hadn't actually brought the moon back. So what was the fuss about? But that night, as the villagers returned to their homes, many paused to glance upward, not in hope or fear, but with the tentative recognition of one who has been seen. And in her cottage by the forest's edge, Madame Koth hung a new bundle of herbs to dry in her window, moonwort and starflower, and a single sprig of something that had no name but glowed faintly in the dark. Outside, the shadows pooled strangely, as if something vast had settled just beyond the lamplight to listen. Chapter 17. The Festival of Lanterns. The idea emerged gradually, as most terrible ideas do. After Madame Koth's confession and the fleeting glimpse of silver light, the villagers of Hollow's End found themselves caught in an odd limbo, no longer resigned to their moonless fate, but uncertain how to proceed. It was the baker's apprentice, a practical girl with flour permanently ground into her cuticles, who first voiced the thought. "If we can't have the real moon," she said, kneading dough that now rose suspiciously well regardless of the hour, "why not make our own?" Thus began the great lantern project. Every household contributed whatever they could spare: wax candles hoarded for winter, precious oil rationed from dwindling stores, even jars of fireflies caught by the children. Ems, thrilled to have a project that didn't involve celestial mechanics, designed an elaborate pulley system to suspend the lanterns above the square. Farmer Burrell sacrificed his last good bedsheet to fashion a giant canopy that would diffuse the light into something approximating moonglow. The night of the festival arrived with unseasonable warmth, the air thick with the scent of melting candle wax, and the baker's peculiar loaves. As dusk fell, the villagers gathered beneath the canopy, their faces upturned like flowers awaiting dawn. "Light them," whispered the mayor. A hush fell as Lems pulled the master cord. Hundreds of lanterns flickered to life above them, their combined glow pooling through the thin fabric in a pale, shimmering imitation of moonlight. For one breathless moment it almost worked. The light fell in soft silver patterns across upturned faces. The shadows pooled gently rather than swallowing everything whole. Someone gasped. Someone else began to cry. Then the first lantern caught fire. It was inevitable, really. Between the cheap tallow, the overdressed pulley ropes, and the general air of desperation, the great lantern project was always going to end in flames. One by one the lanterns winked out, some guttering peacefully, others erupting in small fireballs that sent burning debris drifting down onto the crowd. Chaos ensued. The baker's apprentice beat at flames with her apron. The rationalists shouted conflicting advice about fire safety. Old man Harlow calmly stole a bottle of cider from the wreckage and watched the spectacle from a safe distance. Yet even as the canopy burned and the villagers scrambled to douse the flames, something peculiar happened. The burning scraps of lanterns and fabric didn't fall to earth, as they should have. Instead, they swirled upward in a slow, deliberate spiral, forming a glowing vortex above the square before winking out one by one, as if something had inhaled them. In the sudden darkness that followed, the villagers stood frozen, their faces smudged with soot, their festival in ruins. Then, from the edge of the crowd, Else began to laugh. It wasn't cruel laughter, but the bright, startled kind that comes when absurdity reaches its natural conclusion. One by one, the others joined in, first the children, then the adults, until even the mayor was wheezing into his singed vest. Only Madame Koth remained silent, her gaze fixed on the sky where the flames had vanished. When the laughter finally died down, she spoke just loudly enough to be heard. It came. The villagers followed her gaze. At first, nothing. Then, a flicker. A shimmer. A single shaft of silver light piercing the darkness for the briefest instant before disappearing again. No one could agree afterward if they'd truly seen it. The rationalists blamed afterimages from the fire. The penitents fell to their knees. The indifferentists joined an honorable remark, immersibly full of entire. My newest, out and started collecting usable lantern parts. But as the villagers dispersed to their homes, many paused to glance upward, not at Lem's broken mechanical moon, not at their own pathetic imitations, but at the empty space where the real thing belonged. And if their shadows seemed to stretch a little further than they should have that night, well, perhaps it was just a trick of the light. In her cottage by the woods, Madame Koth hung a new lantern in her window. This one crafted from the last unburned scrap of canopy fabric, with a single candle flickering inside. It cast no light on her walls, no illumination on her floor. But if one stood at just the right angle, looking out toward the forest's edge, its reflection in the glass almost looked like a tiny, perfect moon. Outside, the darkness stirred, not retreating exactly, but making room. Chapter 18. The Silent Wolves. The first night, the wolves didn't howl. No one noticed. The second night, Farmer Burl remarked on it over supper, then promptly forgot. By the seventh consecutive silent night, the entire village was uneasy in a way they couldn't articulate, like missing the ache of a bad tooth once it's gone. Garrett the hunter was the first to investigate. He tracked the pack to their usual den in the northern foothills, expecting to find corpses, perhaps poisoned, perhaps struck by some strange illness. What he found was worse. Healthy wolves watching him with eerie calm from the shadows, their yellow eyes reflecting no light at all. They didn't snarl, didn't flee, simply stared as he backed away, his skin prickling with the certain knowledge that something fundamental had changed. "The pack's still there," he reported at the village meeting, rubbing the mushroom pendant around his neck. "But they're not wolfing?" The baker frowned. "What does that even mean?" "It means they don't act like wolves anymore," Garrett snapped. "No howling, no marking territory. The pups don't even play fight." He hesitated. "They just watch, like they're waiting." A chill settled over the gathering. Wolves that didn't howl were unnatural, like a river that didn't flow or trees that didn't creak in the wind. Hollow's End had always lived in careful balance with its predators, the nightly chorus of howls, as much a part of life as birdsong at dawn. Their absence left a silence that rang louder than any noise. The village children naturally saw opportunity where adults saw omens. Emboldened by the wolves' strange calm, they began daring each other to approach the den. Els led the first expedition, returning with a story that made the adults pale. The wolf pups had played with her hair, their tiny teeth never breaking skin, while the adults looked on with what she swore was amusement. "She's lying," the blacksmith muttered. "Then explain this," his wife countered, plucking a single silver-tipped hair from El's braid. No natural wolf bore such markings. Old Man Harlow examined the strand, his knobby fingers unusually gentle. "Moon wolves," he declared at last. "Or would be, if we still had one." Madame Koth, who had been listening quietly from her usual shadowed corner, made a soft noise of understanding. "They've forgotten their purpose," she said. "Like us." That night, the village tried an experiment. At midnight, when the mechanical moon hung frozen at its zenith, Lems had long since given up repairing it. They gathered in the square with every noise-making implement they could find. Pots, whistles, the schoolhouse's long-unused bell. At the mayor's signal, they erupted into cacophony, howling and banging and shrieking at the star-choked sky like demented revelers. For 5 full minutes, nothing. Then, from the distant foothills, a single answering howl rose, clear and high and heart-breakingly familiar. Another joined it. Then another. Within moments, the night air thrummed with the voices of wolves, singing as they hadn't in months. The villagers cheered. They wept. They hugged each other with uncharacteristic fervor. For the first time since the moon disappeared, something in Hollow's End felt almost right. But as the howls continued, the celebration faltered. There was something off about the sound. Not the notes themselves, but the spaces between them. The pauses lasted a beat too long. The harmonies didn't resolve as they should have. It was as if the wolves were imitating the idea of howling rather than the act itself. Worse yet, when the villagers stopped their noise-making, the wolves didn't. Their song continued, growing stranger with each passing minute, incorporating sounds no wolf throat should produce. The creak of bending branches, the rush of distant water, the faint impossible chime of silver on stone. The villagers fled to their homes, barring doors that had never needed bars before. Only Els remained in the square, her face tilted toward the sound, her expression unreadable. High above, the stars seemed to pulse in time with the unnatural chorus. And deep in the forest, where no human ever ventured after dark, something far older than wolves added its voice to the song. A sound like ice cracking over black water, like roots shifting in frozen earth, like the first whisper of a wind that hadn't blown in centuries. By dawn, the howling had stopped. The wolves were gone from their den, leaving behind only oddly placed paw prints that glistened with something like frost in the morning sun. The villagers didn't speak of that night again. But sometimes, when the wind blew from the north, they would pause in their work and glance uneasily at one another, each wondering if the others heard it too. The faintest echo of a howl that wasn't quite a howl. A reminder. A promise. Chapter 19. The Astronomer's Resignation. Piers the scholar had always been a man of precise habits. Every evening at dusk, he would climb the rickety ladder to his rooftop observatory, really just a wooden platform with a brass telescope bolted to the planks, and log the movements of the heavens with meticulous care. Even after the moon disappeared, he continued his vigil, convinced the anomaly could be explained through rigorous observation. The night he gave up, no one saw coming. It began ordinarily enough. Piers adjusted his telescope, wiped the lens with his ever-present handkerchief, and squinted at the sky. Then, very deliberately, he closed his leather-bound observation journal, tied it shut with twine, and dropped it into the rain barrel below. The splash brought Widow V running from her herb garden, convinced someone had fallen. "I'm done," Piers announced to no one in particular. The widow blinked up at him. "Done with what?" "All of it." He gestured vaguely at the sky, where the stars glittered with their usual indifference. "Pointless exercise, charting the movements of objects that clearly don't follow rules. Might as well document the migration patterns of soap bubbles." Widow V eyed the floating journal in her rain barrel. "You're joking." Piers descended the ladder with exaggerated care, his movements eerily calm. "Consider this. If the moon can simply vanish after millennia of reliable behavior, what's to stop the sun from deciding not to rise tomorrow? Or gravity reversing on a whim? The universe has revealed itself to be fundamentally untrustworthy." He plucked his spectacles from his nose and folded them away in their case. "I refuse to collaborate further with such capricious entities." The news spread through Hollow's End like wildfire. The rationalists were devastated, the penitents smug. The indifferentists barely looked up from their card game. Old Man Harlow tracked Piers down at the tavern, where the scholar was methodically drinking his way through a bottle of something amber and expensive. "So that's it?" Harlow demanded. "You're just giving up?" Piers swirled his drink. "Not giving up. Resigning. There's a difference." "Which is?" "Giving up implies the endeavor was worthwhile to begin with." He tossed back the rest of his glass. "I've wasted years documenting patterns that don't exist. The stars are liars. The sky's a fraud. And I..." He paused dramatically, "am going to take up whittling." The next morning the villagers found Piers' telescope dismantled, its parts arranged in an elaborate spiral pattern in the town square. The brass eyepiece sat at the center, reflecting the weak sunlight in a way that made the cobblestones look strangely lunar. Lens couldn't resist examining the setup. "This is Oddly precise for a tantrum, he admitted, tracing the spiral with one grease-stained finger. Else, who had been watching from the well, said nothing. But that evening, when Piers took his customary place on the tavern stool, he found a single object waiting beside his usual drink. One of the silver-tipped wolf hairs, coiled into a perfect spiral on the polished wood. Piers stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from his bones, he pulled a pencil and napkin from his pocket and began sketching. Not star charts this time, but something far stranger. A map of shadows, tracing how they fell differently now that the world had tilted off its axis. Above him, the tavern's lantern flickered, casting his silhouette against the wall in a shape that almost, but not quite, resembled a crescent moon. And out in the forest, where no villagers dared go after dark, something that had been holding its breath for a very long time finally exhaled. The trees shivered with it. The river changed course by a fraction of an inch. A single silver-tipped wolf raised its head and made a sound that wasn't a howl, but might have been the beginning of one. Piers, oblivious to all this, continued sketching long into the night, not because he believed it mattered, but because some habits, like some celestial bodies, refuse to disappear simply because you will them to. Chapter 20. The First Light of Dawn. The dawn broke in a way no one in Hollow's End had ever seen before. It began with an absence, and not the oppressive, moonless dark they had grown accustomed to, but a softer kind of emptiness, as if the night itself had taken a deep breath and held it. Then, slowly, the horizon bled color. Not the usual hesitant pinks and golds, but a riot of violets and molten copper spreading across the sky like a wound. The clouds, thin, scattered, caught fire one by one, glowing so fiercely that for one dizzying moment the villagers forgot they had ever missed the moon at all. Farmer Burl was the first to see it, stumbling bleary-eyed from his barn to find the world washed in impossible hues. He stood there, pitchfork forgotten in his hand, until his wife came to fetch him and fell silent beside him. One by one the villagers emerged from their homes, drawn by some unspoken signal, their faces upturned like flowers. Even old man Harlow hobbled out, squinting at the spectacle with something resembling awe. "Never seen a sunrise like that," the baker murmured. "Maybe," Elle said quietly, "it's because we've never really looked before." And it was true. Before the moon vanished, dawn had been an afterthought, a practical marker of time, a signal to rise and work. But now, after so many months of darkness that clung like tar, this sunrise felt like a revelation. The light didn't just illuminate, it transformed. The thatched roofs gleamed like gilded crowns. The dew on the grass sparkled like scattered gems. Even the dusty square, worn by generations of footsteps, seemed to ripple under the colors, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath, and only now remembered to exhale. Piers the scholar, who had sworn off celestial observation, stood barefoot in the grass, his charts and telescopes abandoned, and laughed, a sound so unexpected that the villagers turned to stare. "All this time," he said, shaking his head, "we've been waiting for the wrong light." Madame Coth, wrapped in her patchwork cloak, reached out as if to catch the colors in her hands. "It doesn't replace the moon," she said softly. "But perhaps it doesn't have to." The rationalists, of course, tried to explain it. Some trick of atmospheric dust, an unusual refraction of light. The penitents whispered of divine mercy. The indifferentists just stood there soaking it in, too stunned to pretend they didn't care. As the sun climbed higher, the spectacle faded, but the world remained changed. The villagers moved through their day differently, pausing to watch the way the light caught on the river, on the wings of passing birds, on each other's faces. Even the baker's bread, pulled fresh from the oven at midday, seemed to glow with a warmth that had nothing to do with heat. That evening, as the sky deepened to twilight, the villagers gathered in the square without discussion. They didn't bring lanterns or mechanical moons or pleas carved into wood. They simply stood together, watching the last embers of sunlight fade. And when the first stars appeared, sharp and bright in the moonless dark, no one flinched. No one cursed. They simply stood there, breathing in the night, letting it be what it was. High above, beyond sight, beyond reach, something vast and silent observed them. And if, in that moment, a single shaft of silver light flickered for the briefest instant between the stars, well, perhaps it was just a trick of the eyes. Or perhaps some absences, when stared at long enough, begin to fill themselves in. In her cottage by the woods, Madame Koth lit a single candle and set it in the window. Outside, the unnatural wolves howled, not the eerie, broken song of before, but something closer to what they once were. And in the square, the villagers lingered, their faces turned upward, their shadows stretching long and true behind them, waiting but no longer afraid.